Here's what Jung understood that the spiritual marketplace doesn't want you to know. Awakening isn't difficult because it's mystical or rare. It's difficult because it requires psychological death. And 90% of people seeking awakening are actually seeking comfort. Think about what spiritual awakening has become. A more peaceful life, better relationships, less anxiety, inner happiness, relief from suffering. These aren't awakening, they're improved ego functioning. And there's nothing wrong with that, except when you mistake ego improvement for ego transcendence. Jung saw this pattern constantly. People would come to him claiming they wanted awakening, transformation, enlightenment. But what they actually wanted was to feel better while remaining fundamentally the same. They wanted awakening that didn't require sacrifice, transformation that didn't demand death, consciousness that didn't cost anything. He'd ask a simple question: are you willing to lose everything you think you are? And watch them realize they weren't seeking awakening. They were seeking an upgraded version of their current identity. This is the core problem. True awakening isn't additive, it's subtractive. It's not gaining spiritual experiences, it's losing psychological defenses. Not acquiring peace, it's surrendering control. Not becoming enlightened, it's dying as the person who wants enlightenment. And 90% of seekers unconsciously resist the very thing they consciously pursue. They're standing at the edge of psychological death, calling it the spiritual path, hoping awakening will happen without having to jump. Jung identified 5 specific ways this resistance operates, 5 psychological mechanisms that masquerade as seeking while preventing awakening. And once you see them, you'll recognize them everywhere, especially in yourself. The first reason people never awaken sounds paradoxical, but once you understand it, you'll see why seeking has become more popular than finding. Jung discovered that unconsciousness is psychologically comfortable in ways consciousness can never be, and most seekers are unwilling to give up that comfort. When you're unconscious, you have certainty. Your beliefs are true. Your identity is solid. Your worldview makes sense. Your tribe is right. Your suffering has clear external causes. You know who you are, what you want, and who's to blame when you don't get it. Unconsciousness provides psychological structure, walls that contain your identity, ceiling that limits your responsibility, floor that prevents existential freefall. It's a small room, but it's familiar, predictable, safe. Awakening dissolves those walls. Suddenly your beliefs are revealed as constructions. Your identity fragments into roles and personas. Your worldview shows its contradictions. Your tribe's righteousness looks like collective shadow projection. Your suffering traces back to you. You lose all certainty about who you are and what's true. Jung called this the terror of consciousness. Not a dramatic mystical experience, but the quiet horror of having all psychological structures dissolve. And here's the key. The ego experiences this dissolution as death. Because it is death. Death of everything you've been using to feel secure. Most seekers want awakening's gifts without awakening's cost. They want expanded consciousness while keeping their identity intact. Peace without surrender. Freedom without loss. Enlightenment without psychological death. So they engage in what Jung called spiritual tourism, collecting experiences, practices, teachers, insights. They meditate but maintain their defenses, read spiritual texts but keep their worldview, attend retreats but return to their patterns, seek awakening but unconsciously ensure it never fully happens. One of Jung's patients perfectly captured this resistance. I've spent 10 years seeking enlightenment. I've tried every practice, every teacher, every path, and I just realized I've been using seeking as a way to avoid finding, because finding means losing the seeker, and I've built my entire identity around being a spiritual seeker. Awakening would destroy the very person who wants to awaken. This is the first great barrier. Unconsciousness is comfortable, and awakening is terrifying. You say you want to wake up, but your psyche knows what that costs, and it's not willing to pay. The spiritual marketplace feeds this resistance perfectly. It sells awakening as gain rather than loss, addition rather than subtraction, enhancement rather than annihilation. So, people stay comfortable seekers rather than becoming uncomfortable finders. But there's a second reason even more insidious. Here's what Jung discovered that spiritual communities desperately avoid. You can't awaken while rejecting half of your psyche. The second reason 90% fail is simple but brutal. Awakening requires shadow integration. And most seekers are actually seeking to become better, purer, more enlightened versions of their ego, which is the exact opposite of integration. When most people say spiritual awakening, they mean transcending their darkness, rising above anger, jealousy, selfishness, pettiness, becoming love, light, compassion, peace, spiritual materialism at its finest, collecting positive qualities while disowning negative ones. Jung would say, that's not awakening, that's ego inflation dressed in spiritual language. Real awakening requires you to turn toward your shadow, the parts you've spent your life denying, repressing, projecting onto others. Your capacity for cruelty, your selfishness, your pettiness, your rage, your desire for power, all of it. Not to indulge it, but to integrate it. To own that these aren't foreign invaders, they're you. To stop projecting your shadow onto those people and recognize it in yourself. To end the exhausting performance of being good and become psychologically whole instead. But this is terrifying because it demolishes spiritual identity. You can't be an awakened being while integrating your shadow. You can't be enlightened while owning your darkness. You can't maintain spiritual superiority while admitting you contain the same ugliness you condemn in others. Think of it like trying to see only your reflection in a mirror while ignoring the shadow it casts behind you. You can spend your whole life angling yourself, adjusting the lighting, perfecting your image, but the shadow remains. The more you focus on making your reflection perfect, the larger and more distorted your shadow becomes. Real awakening isn't about perfecting the reflection, it's about turning around and finally looking at the shadow you've been avoiding. And most seekers would rather spend eternity perfecting their spiritual reflection than turn around for even one moment to face what they've cast behind them. Jung observed this pattern in spiritual communities constantly. The awakened were often the most shadow-possessed, projecting their disowned darkness onto the unenlightened, using spirituality as a defense against self-knowledge, performing love while leaking hostility. This is why most never awaken. They're seeking to escape their shadow, not integrate it. They want to transcend their darkness rather than include it. Become light by denying darkness. Achieve enlightenment by rejecting everything that isn't enlightened. But Jung was clear. There's no wholeness without shadow integration. You can have mystical experiences, profound insights, altered states, but without shadow work, you're just a spiritually inflated ego with peak experiences, still asleep, just dreaming lucidly. And this connects directly to the third reason. Shadow rejection keeps seekers comfortable, but the third barrier is what keeps them perpetually busy, while ensuring nothing actually changes. Jung noticed something fascinating about seekers. They collected information voraciously, but remained fundamentally unchanged. Why? Because the ego learned to mistake understanding for transformation. Modern spirituality has become an information economy. Watch this video, read this book, attend this workshop, learn this practice, understand this concept. The ego loves this. It can accumulate spiritual knowledge while remaining in complete control. You can understand Jung's shadow work without doing shadow work. Comprehend non-dual awareness without experiencing it. Explain the ego death without dying. Discuss enlightenment without being enlightened. The mind becomes incredibly sophisticated at simulating awakening without actually awakening. Jung called this intellectual enlightenment, the ego's most sophisticated defense against transformation. You become an expert on awakening while remaining asleep. You speak the language fluently while never leaving your country. You understand the map with perfect clarity while never taking the journey. One patient, a philosophy professor specializing in Eastern spirituality, came to Jung in crisis. I can lecture on Buddhism, explain Vedanta, teach meditation theory. My students think I'm awakened, but I'm completely fraudulent. I understand everything intellectually, but haven't experienced anything authentically. I've built an entire identity around knowing about awakening while ensuring I never actually awaken. Through analysis, he realized his intellectual understanding was actually preventing transformation. Every time he approached the edge of real change, his mind would leap to understanding rather than experiencing, analyzing rather than surrendering, conceptualizing rather than embodying. Jung would tell him, "Your intelligence is your greatest obstacle. You can think your way out of every uncomfortable feeling, analyze your way around every ego death, conceptualize your way past every transformation. You've turned awakening into an intellectual puzzle to solve rather than a death to die." This is epidemic in modern spirituality. People, watch videos about meditation instead of meditating. Read books about presence instead of being present. Discuss enlightenment instead of pursuing it. Understand ego death intellectually while clinging to identity desperately. Collect teachings like trophies while remaining unchanged. The ego is brilliant at this substitution. It says, "Look how much I know about awakening. Surely this is awakening." But knowledge about fire doesn't burn. Understanding about water doesn't quench thirst. Information about transformation doesn't transform. Jung was ruthless about this distinction. You can study psychology for 50 years and remain completely unconscious. Or you can do the work and transform in 5. The choice is whether you want to know about consciousness or become conscious. Most choose knowing. It's safer, more controllable, more comfortable. You can be a seeker forever, accumulating knowledge, feeling spiritual, avoiding the actual death transformation requires. But there's a fourth barrier that operates even when you're willing to do the work. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, the comfort-seeking dressed as seeking, the shadow rejection disguised as transcendence, the information collecting replacing actual transformation, you're not failing at awakening. You're discovering why it's been eluding you. Jung believed these barriers aren't obstacles to overcome through more seeking. They're invitations to stop seeking and start dying, to stop collecting and start surrendering, to stop understanding and start experiencing. Before we explore the final 2 reasons that reveal why most people never complete this death, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these next reasons show why even willing seekers often fail, and what that means for authentic transformation. Even when seekers move past comfort, shadow rejection, and information collection, there's a 4th barrier that's almost impossible to see, because the thing observing is the thing that needs to die. Jung's most profound insight: the ego co-opts the awakening process to ensure its own survival. And most seekers never see it happening because the ego is what's seeking. Here's the trap. Who wants awakening? The ego. Who's reading books about awakening? The ego. Who's doing spiritual practices? The ego. Who's having mystical experiences? The ego. Who's seeking to kill the ego? The ego. The entire spiritual journey can become the ego's most sophisticated survival strategy, seeking awakening in ways that guarantee awakening never happens, creating a spiritual ego that's even more entrenched than the normal ego, because now it's enlightened, awakened, conscious. Think of it like a snake trying to shed its own skin by eating itself. The snake believes if it just consumes enough of itself, it will achieve transformation. But the more it eats, the more it reinforces that it's still the snake. The eating is done by the snake. The effort is the snake's effort. The very act of trying to consume itself proves the snake still exists. Real shedding happens when the snake stops trying to eat itself and instead allows the old skin to naturally split and fall away. But the ego can never accept this because it means the end of the snake doing anything. Jung saw this constantly. Patients would achieve profound insights, have powerful experiences, undergo dramatic transformations, but the ego would remain intact, just wearing spiritual clothing. The angry person became righteously awake to others' unconsciousness. The judgmental person became discerning about who was truly enlightened. The superior person became further along the path. This is the spiritual ego, and it's more dangerous than the normal ego because it's invisible to itself. It seeks awakening to become special, pursues enlightenment to be superior, does shadow work to be more integrated than others, practices meditation to be more conscious. Everything becomes fuel for ego inflation. Jung identified the telltale signs: judging others' level of consciousness, subtle spiritual superiority, using awakening language while remaining unchanged, collecting experiences as spiritual credentials, measuring progress on the path, identifying as awakened or enlightened, feeling chosen or special for awareness. All of these are ego surviving through spiritual identification. The very thing that needs to die has just changed clothes. And here's why this is almost impossible to escape. You can't use the ego to kill the ego. Every spiritual practice the ego does reinforces the ego doing it. Every meditation session confirms there's a meditator. Every moment of awareness proves there's someone aware. The seeker seeking is the problem, but the seeker can't see that because it's the one looking. Jung's solution was indirect, not trying to kill the ego, but creating conditions where it might die on its own. Through analysis, through suffering, through life circumstances that crack the ego's defenses, but never through the ego's own effort, because that just strengthens it. This is why most seekers never awaken. The very thing seeking awakening is the thing preventing it. And the ego is so clever, it can even turn this understanding into another identity. I'm the person who knows the ego co-opts spirituality. Same trap, new level. But there's a fifth reason that might be the most important. Even if you navigate past all these barriers, there's one final resistance that Jung believed was the most powerful, and it comes from outside you. The fifth reason most never awaken. The collective unconscious actively pulls you back to sleep. And this force is stronger than individual will. Jung discovered that consciousness isn't just individual, it's collective. Society operates on shared unconsciousness. Culture runs on collective agreements, unexamined assumptions, mass projections. And it only functions if everyone participates. When someone starts to awaken, they begin breaking those collective agreements. They see through cultural narratives, question social norms, withdraw from mass consciousness, and the collective responds with enormous psychological pressure to conform, to return, to go back to sleep. This pressure comes in forms most seekers don't recognize as resistance: social rejection. Friends and family become uncomfortable. You're too intense, too different, too weird. Relationships based on shared unconsciousness end. The social cost of consciousness becomes clear. Economic pressure. Awakening often makes you incompatible with normal career paths. You can't participate in systems you see through. Can't perform roles that require unconsciousness. Suddenly you're facing financial instability. Psychological gaslighting. Everyone tells you you're going through a phase, having a crisis, being too serious, overthinking. The collective insists your awakening is pathology. Isolation. As you become more conscious, you become more alone. The collective comfort of unconscious belonging is replaced by the solitude of awareness. Jung saw this repeatedly. Patients would begin awakening, make profound progress, start transforming. Then the collective would pull them back. A family crisis would demand they return to their old role. Financial pressure would force them back into careers they had outgrown. Social isolation would become unbearable. And slowly they'd fall back asleep, not from weakness, but from the immense gravitational force of collective unconsciousness. One woman's case exemplifies this. She'd undergone profound transformation through analysis, integrated her shadow, dissolved ego identifications, achieved genuine consciousness. Then she tried to return to her life. Her husband couldn't relate to her anymore. Her friends found her alienating. Her career felt absurd. Her church community rejected her questions. Within 6 months, she'd unconsciously repressed her awakening to maintain her relationships. She chose collective belonging over individual consciousness, not consciously, but because the alternative was complete isolation from everything she'd known. Jung told her something crucial. Awakening has a price. The collective will not celebrate your consciousness, it will punish it. You're breaking the agreement everyone else is keeping, and they'll pressure you to return, not from malice, but from unconsciousness protecting itself. This is why most spiritual communities fail. They try to be both awake and collectively comfortable. But that's impossible. Real awakening creates misfits, outsiders, hermits. People who can't go back to sleep, no matter how much the collective pulls them. Jung believed only about 10% have the psychological constitution to resist this pull, not because they're special or chosen, but because something in them values consciousness more than belonging. They're willing to be alone rather than asleep, rejected rather than unconscious, isolated rather than absorbed back into collective comfort. Most seekers discover they're not willing to pay this price. They want awakening that lets them keep their relationships, careers, social belonging, and that awakening doesn't exist. So they remain in spiritual communities that simulate awakening while maintaining collective comfort. They attend retreats that provide peak experiences but demand no fundamental change. They follow teachers who promise transformation without sacrifice. They seek awakening while unconsciously ensuring they stay embedded in the collective, and the collective wins every time. Let me synthesize what Jung discovered about why 90% never awaken. 1. They're seeking comfort disguised as awakening, wanting peace without ego death. 2. They're rejecting their shadow while claiming integration, pursuing light by denying darkness. 3. They're collecting information instead of transforming, understanding awakening intellectually while remaining unchanged. 4. Their ego co-opts the process, seeking awakening in ways that guarantee the ego survives. 5. The collective unconscious pulls them back, choosing belonging over consciousness when forced to choose. These aren't flaws in seeking, they're features of human psychology. The psyche resists awakening because awakening is death. The ego fights consciousness because consciousness dissolves ego. The collective rejects the individual who awakens because it threatens collective unconsciousness. Jung didn't see this as tragedy. He saw it as accurate psychological understanding. Awakening is rare because it's genuinely difficult. Not mystically difficult, but psychologically difficult. It requires what most people aren't willing to give, everything they think they are. But here's what Jung emphasized. This isn't about being special or chosen. It's about being willing. Willing to be uncomfortable rather than false. Willing to integrate shadow rather than project it. Willing to transform rather than just understand. Willing to let ego die rather than preserve it. Willing to be alone rather than absorbed in collective unconsciousness. Most aren't willing, not from weakness but from a rational calculation. The cost is too high. And Jung would say, that's okay. Not everyone needs to awaken. The collective requires unconsciousness to function. Most people living unconsciously isn't failure. It's how society works. But for the 10% who can't go back to sleep no matter the cost, Jung's insights become a roadmap through the barriers everyone else stops at. If you've been seeking awakening but not finding it, Jung would want you to ask one honest question. Do you want awakening, or do you want an improved ego? Because if you want an improved ego, better feelings, more peace, less anxiety, spiritual experiences, there's nothing wrong with that. Pursue it honestly, but don't call it awakening. If you actually want awakening, real, irreversible, fundamental transformation, then Jung says, stop seeking and start dying. Stop collecting teachings and integrate one truth. Stop avoiding your shadow and turn toward it. Stop understanding awakening and experience one moment of it. Stop letting your ego lead the process and create conditions for it to crack. Stop choosing belonging over consciousness. The 90% fail because they want awakening without sacrifice. They want consciousness without cost. They want transformation without death. And Jung says, that's not how it works. That's never been how it works. Awakening doesn't happen to seekers. It happens when seeking collapses, when the ego exhausts itself, when life cracks your defenses, when you're forced to choose between consciousness and comfort, and you choose consciousness despite knowing what it costs. If you're still seeking, you're in the 90%. If you're willing to stop seeking and start surrendering, you might join the 10%. Not because you're special, but because you're willing to pay the price that most people aren't. Jung's final insight: awakening isn't an achievement, it's a death you stop resisting. Stop trying to awaken. Stop trying to be enlightened. Just stop resisting the death that's been trying to happen all along. If this confronted something in you, subscribe to this channel where we explore Jung's unfiltered psychology for those willing to see uncomfortable truths. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.